why don't we take a few questions from the audience, and please make them questions and not speeches. You have people here who can do really terrific speeches if you only set them up. So any questions from the audience on anything that's been said or anything that worries you? Sorry, who are you, and could you identify yourself, please?
Sure. My name is Asaf Palgi, and I'm from New York. I work in financial services. My question is a little more geared towards the global reserve in terms of a currency reserve. It was mentioned that there's not too much effectiveness of monetary policy. Over the last 12 months, we've seen some sovereigns get downgraded from AAA to AA. So I was wondering, what do you see in the future in terms of a global currency? Is the U.S. currency going to be the one that's going to lead the way, especially with the euro playing how it is? And your thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, Alan, please.
One thing that does worry me is what happens when orthodox monetary policy goes unorthodox. Luckily, in our case, we haven't had to go there. In the case of Israel, you haven't had to go there. But for those large economies that have, it's quite a difficult area, and there are some unknowns around. And any historian of the 1930s doesn't want to see trade protection of that sort coming up again during this troubled times. But I'm more worried about monetary protection in the sense where we've now got 4 large economic zones that are all carrying out major quantitative easing, and in doing that are impacting exchange rates all around the world. And Israel and New Zealand are both countries that have felt that, and that I think is quite damaging. How do you get off quantitative easing? We haven't seen that yet. Japan's had 10 or 15 years on and hasn't got off it yet. That's going to be a real issue for us all.
Anyone want to add a word to that?
My one word is the dollar.
Thanks. We have time for 2 more questions.
Currency.
Edward Litvak, CSIS. I think the discussion is not advanced by presenting a parody of the German Chancellor's problem. The German Chancellor is an elected politician who has lost 7 land elections in a row because the German press keeps publishing stories to the effect that, for example, the governor of the province of Bolzano in Italian, earns twice as much as the German chancellor. The head of the Greek central bank, right through this crisis, earns much more than the head of the Bundesbank. The cost of a cup of coffee in Athens is twice as much as in Hamburg because of a whole series of licensing restrictions, and all kinds of things, none of which have been changed at all since the beginning of the crisis. This crisis, before it became a financial crisis, it was a competitiveness crisis. These economies had become uncompetitive because of restrictions. And the question is, how can the Germans remedy the competitiveness thing? Let's assume that you eliminate the debt completely. The Germans assume the debt, no debt. The next day, they would have to start lending money again because of competitiveness. So let's not make fun of the German Chancellor, recognize that there is an underlying competitive problem, and the Germans cannot be expected to pay both for the accumulated debts and for the ones that will start instantly.
I want to make it clear that I was not making fun of the German Chancellor. My point was a very serious one. She has failed consistently to explain to her people, her voters, the benefits that they derive from the monetary union in giving Germany a much weaker currency than it would otherwise have had, a far more competitive currency than it would have had if the Deutschmark had been retained. Instead, she has encouraged German voters to believe that their greater competitiveness is the result of some moral superiority to people in the rest of Europe. And I think this has been a colossal failure of leadership. And I know that is also the view of former German Chancellor Helmut Kohl, who in a searing speech directed at her in Berlin, which I was present to hear when he was awarded the Kissinger Prize some year and a half ago, said that she had failed to realize that Germany must put Europe first in order for the unity of Germany to be legitimate. I agree with what he said then. I think she has a much larger share of responsibility for this crisis than any German would care to acknowledge.
We have time for one more question. Well, ladies standing up there, please. And could you introduce yourself when you get the mic?
Lorna Fitzsimons, Great Britain. Do people not think that the problem, the economic problem, stems from the ineptitude of European politicians to actually adequately explain or win the arguments with their publics over a series of decades? And if they do they see any European politician with the skill, desire or wit to overcome this huge crisis and explain what is necessary to overcome to the peoples of Europe that at the moment are going in rapidly the other direction to the solution that is needed economically?
Martin, thanks.
I wanted to defend Frau Merkel, but I won't do so. Just to say that, well, perhaps it fits very well in this sense. The strongest opposition to a federal Europe, which is part of the logical conclusion of, is indeed the logical conclusion of this project, as of course Neil knows very well, came from France and not from Germany, which has always said it would accept this provided everybody was prepared to commit themselves to that sort of solution. And that's core part of this. So one aspect of the political failure is all the leaders are never on the same page at the same time. And then in some sense, among 17 countries, that's inevitable. It's a structural problem. It's not just a failure of political leadership. There is one aspect of political leadership I will stress, because it's not about how they've handled it now. Because there, apart from this comment, I sort of largely agree. But it is central. When I was writing 20 years ago columns rather critical of this new idea, one of the points I made is that if you join a currency union, you are giving up what has always been the principal safety valve for your economies if they don't function that well, if they lose competitiveness. I won't go into the question of why they tended to, but it was well known that certain countries tended to devalue every so often to deal with the consequences of what had happened in the intervening times. The implication of that was very clear, that in order to work within the currency union, the way the labor market operated, the way the economy operated, the way the public sector operated had to change in a very profound way. And no political leader in the 90s and early 2000s in the countries where this was important paid any attention to this whatsoever. Instead, and here is where I really am with the Germans, they took a windfall. There was a windfall of 10 years of incredibly easy monetary conditions in which they could ignore all that. And then the bus came and hit them. And when the bus hit them, it was too late. Now, the Germans actually benefited from this process too, which is why they also didn't complain all these years. But it is clearly true that the leadership of Europe over a quarter of a century, certainly over 20 years, never took seriously the obvious economic, social and political implications of giving up the exchange rate forever. And that's a pretty serious failure of leadership. Now, Neil says, now in the next year or two, they're going to make up for all that. They're going to sort that problem out and create a federal union. God, I hope he's right.
Usually am.
Sorry,
Can I give a really short answer?
What did you just modestly say?
Can I give a short answer and then shut up? I think there are very few politicians today in Europe of the caliber of Margaret Thatcher. But one to watch is Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, whose speech in Berlin, in which he said he feared Germany now doing too little rather than too much, an extraordinary thing for a Polish statesman to say, was one of the best speeches by a European leader of the last decade. He's the man to watch. If there's going to be a president of this federal Europe, he gets my vote.
We're at a point where I'd like to ask each of the participants, starting this time in the original order, that is with Richard, telling us whether he agrees with all these predictions, or some of them, or with which of them you don't agree. There is, by the way, one country in Europe which fully accepted the logic of the single fixed exchange rate. That was Germany. After German unification, they undertook a program which it did ensure they fixed the exchange rate at a totally ridiculous level, and then between East and West Germany, and then undertook a program which many of us said they're not doing anything, but now we see what they were doing, and they produced a much more efficient economy out of that. So these things are possible, possibly only within the borders of one country. There is another possibility, which is that they are going to keep pushing that the scenario which Neil described is in fact a planned scenario. Keep pushing as long as possible, and then hope you get it right when the time comes to change. The trouble with those strategies are they require exquisite timing, and exquisite timing is not that frequent in a complex political situation. But anyway, Richard, please fire away.
Yeah, building on what you just said, Stanley, there is that thought that a lot of what the Germans are doing is basically holding out to the last possible minute so they get the best possible terms in exchange for their largesse. I would think that the timing issue is going to be impossible to work out. And more broadly, I think nationalism's powerful. And at the end of the day, national capitals are still more of a reality than Brussels. And I think that's likely to be the case. I think this has enormous consequences. Europe is 1/4 of the world's economic output. It means it's going to then be steadily going down as a share of the world economy, which has repercussions not just for itself, but for everybody else, including, by the way, places like China, whose entire economic model, which has been based upon export bias, is unsustainable. And indeed, one of the real questions in the next couple of years is going to be, or decades, is going to be China's ability to transition from an export-led economy to one that's much more heavily influenced or supported by domestic demand and consumption. And that little piece of economic and political rebalancing, I would simply say, will be no mean feat if it can be pulled off. I would just challenge two things I heard on this panel, because I actually tend to share the Euro pessimism. One is the China optimism there that I heard from Alan. I actually think the inbox of Mr. Xi, who's going to be taking over China soon, is one of the most daunting inboxes of any leader in the world. Whether it's the economic rebalancing I just alluded to, the need to slow in some ways an overheated economy, more than 100,000 sizable political protests a year, rampant corruption, and one could go on. It's an extraordinary set of challenges, and all these people who basically look at the world and say China's rise is inevitable, maybe, but I think the Chinese leadership is going to have to deal with all these problems, and I wouldn't be surprised if there's a major debate in China looking at questions of reform versus repression versus nationalism about how it maintains domestic political order and legitimacy there. Neil raised the point about the U.S.-China relationship. I would just simply say that I think for the next period, whether it's next decade, I'm much more worried again about medium powers, the Irans, North Koreas. I think the long-term 21st century question, you're right, is whether the United States, China, and others can work out their bilateral relations, and perhaps just as important, whether in any way they can reach any consensus about what ought to be the global rules and the global institutions to back them up. And I actually think, again, the real danger of the 21st century is less U.S.-Chinese friction, which I don't discount, but either apart from it or as a result of it, the inability of the United States and China to build international arrangements that are in any way up to the global challenges of the era. And if they can't, then you really do face a world of growing disorder, which has all sorts of adverse consequences for everyone.
Thanks. Alan, please.
Yes, as economic forecasters, we're always trying to work out what's happening around the world, and we're certainly trying to forecast Europe. But actually, we don't think the Eurozone is forecastable, particularly at the moment. There's too many moving parts. It's a big multivariate problem, and it's now moving from the realms of an economic issue to a political one. When you get a situation like that, we think that good smaller countries like mine and Israel's are well advised to make sure that they've got their own economies in order and as robust as possible. We think the way that we at least intend to do that is to ensure that we're as balanced as possible, and in many cases that means actually some continued reduction in debt so that we're prepared for things that can happen, but we want to do that while we keep on growing. We don't get in an austerity trap, and as I'm sure you all know, that old Yiddish proverb, worries go down much better with a bowl of soup. Thank you.
Talking of bowls of soup, we're all that stands between you and dinner, so I'm going to be very brief in conclusion. Richard began by arguing that we were witnessing a diffusion of power in the world. I disagree. We're witnessing increasing concentration of wealth and power, and the concentration of capital is really one of the most extraordinarily interesting stories of our time. This is, of course, what the Occupy movement became exercised by. That concentration of power in Europe means that I think Germany will be able to impose the kind of structural reforms that it dreams of on the rest of Europe. That's how the federal system will work. But what will the distributional consequences of that be, one wonders? Not very pretty, and that brings me to my final point. All of this talk about debt, and indeed the 1% versus the 99%, overlooks the reality that the real inequity today is between the generations. The vast debts accumulated by the so-called baby boomers are a problem for those only just born or as yet unborn who have no votes and had no say in the reckless policies that produce these debts. This conference is about tomorrow. It's therefore about the next generation. And what I find most disturbing about these huge debts we've been discussing is what they imply for tomorrow and that next generation.
I can't resist this, because this point is made constantly, and I think it's fundamentally misleading. The debt, the gross debt, the net debt we are going to bequeath to our descendants is, of course, zero. What we are going to do is bequeath debts to some and assets to others. So the inequality problem will remain exactly the same as what is now, but in a slightly different form in the next generation. And that is really going to be the important part of what we bequeath. However, I would like to add just two incredibly quick comments. First, I agree completely with what Richard said about China. I have increasingly believed that the model they're now on is unsustainable, and it's going to be an extraordinarily difficult job to transform it smoothly. And the second point I would make is I think Neil's being too confident about the ability of Germany to impose the federal solution. And this is my simple story. In 1992, France, by the tiniest margin, the greatest disaster in the history of Europe, voted to accept the currency union. By about 50.5%, I can't remember the exact percentage point, over 49.5. If only it had gone the other way. If they agree a federal constitution, a genuinely federal constitution, there are going to be referenda. Otherwise, such a profound constitutional transformation will be fundamentally illegitimate. They are going to lose those referenda. They are not going to win them. This constitution will not be enacted.
Well, I think the whole situation is entirely clear now, and and we've also got Martin's political platform summarized in one sentence, so we've made a lot of progress. I'd like to thank the four panelists for a really very interesting discussion.